Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Very mindful it's the slot just before lunch, so we're going to keep this one as exciting and dynamic as possible. So, firstly, I would love to introduce my fantastic panel to the stage, and I'll move along a bit so you can actually get onto the stage. We have Jean-Paul Servet, the chair of the International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO for short. Elena Vinez Fiestas, the chair of the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance and commissioner of the Spanish Financial Markets Authority. We have Lee White, exec director of the IFRS Foundation. We have Daniel Roth, the head of ESG at Volkswagen. And we have Taylor Francis, co-founder of Watershed. So please come to the stage. Welcome all. Thank you. So, firstly for you, what are the steps that you feel are needed from various stakeholders within the ecosystem, from government to policy bodies to FIs and multinational corporations, in improving and ensuring consistent and comparable and reliable sustainability disclosures? I think for this one, we'll start with you, Lee.
Lovely. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. It's an exciting time at the ISSB. Our focus, as your question alludes to, is all around adoption of the two standards that we recently launched, S1 and S2, which we did at the end of June. Since then, we've been encouraged by the response we've received from the global investor community, so that gives a certain level of momentum to the uptake of the standards. Secondly, and I'm sure my good colleague here, Jean-Paul, will speak more about this, but we were fortunate to earn the endorsement of IOSCO, which was announced in late July, and that again gives a significant amount of momentum to the picking up of the standards. And then most recently, we also had an announcement by the Financial Stability Board about the culmination of the work and the transfer of the TCFD across to the foundation as well. All of these landmarks and milestones give a sense of momentum, all directed to then adoption. So we will approach adoption in two ways: a top-down approach via jurisdictional engagement, via policy setters and securities regulators, and a bottom-up where the global investor community asking for the preparers to take it up. So my encouragement today is watch this space. It's an exciting time.
Fantastic, and certainly a huge achievement, and great to see this convergence of support for what you're doing.
Very much.
It's great to see.
Yeah.
Jean-Paul, it'd be great to have you also come in on this question.
Thanks for this excellent question, and good afternoon, everyone. I think that by definition, I would say it's a joint journey for everybody, not only on the stage, but in this conference. It's a joint journey for standard setters, for regulators, for preparers and users. And there is the reason why I think that it's a rather unique journey for everything is that the starting point is not as usual for people like me. I'm not sure that everybody knows what it means IOSCO. So I think that many people know what it means Basel Committee. We are in fact the Basel Committee, but located in Madrid. And we are in charge of many aspects relating to cross-border regulation, to financial market products and consumer protection. So it means that all members are involved in the supervision in the various capacity of 95% of all the financial sector all around the world, SEC, BaFin, CNMV, not far from the headquarters in Madrid, and the FSMA in Belgium. For me, most of the time, I would say when I am tasked to think about reforms, the starting point is a rather negative one. It means there was a financial crisis and we have to learn some lessons from a crisis. In this aspect relating to sustainable finance, there is no as such financial crisis. There are, of course, impact from a financial point of view. But the starting point is absolutely gorgeous, optimistic. And I can tell you, as supervisor for more than 15 years as chair of the FSMA, is the first and the last time of my career. And the starting point, it's you. At least if you are a private investor. Starting point is not the FSB, it's not the G20, it's not IOSCO, it's not a government, it's John and Mary in the street. And John and Mary in the street would like to understand which kind of toolkit they could use in order to decide where they would like to invest in a financial instrument, in a listed company, and for which I need a toolkit, I would say. That's fascinating, because as the first time in my life, John and Mary in the street are so woke to say, we need to have not a puzzle of different labels, we want one common language. But John and Mary in the street are not waiting for us for a while. They are asking us, we need, I would say, action, and very rapidly. And that's the reason why I had the pleasure to be elected by all the board members. It was just before the COP28 in Sharm el-Sheikh. My first comment was to say that the second reason why you need a journal, we need a deadline. Personally, I don't think that a deadline is as such a problem. Mm-hmm. It's an opportunity. And my first comment is to say 2024. Because if Daniel needs to understand how he will apply this standard, he needs a deadline. If one of my favorite victims, I would say Lee, they have to be able to prepare to draft. And that's the reason why I think, first comment, frankly speaking, my first comment on stage was to say 2024. It was a surprise for many people, except for the boss of Lee, a former commissioner, a wise man, Hercule Cadeng, saying, well, there is a guy located, based in Brussels, Jean-Paul Servet, chair of ISSB, saying, we need to be ready in 2024. And that's what we will do. I will come back on this in a few minutes, yes. If you want.
So this is really interesting, and maybe we can actually go slightly off piece and pick up on this point. So from your perspective, Daniel, as somebody who's more on the receiving end of these requirements, can you talk a little bit about responding to these deadlines and what it means from an operational perspective, from a planning and a business perspective to align your processes, not just in the strictest sense of completing the reporting requirement, but then what it actually means for the business?
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to do so. And thanks for inviting me to this panel. I do not feel, or I consider myself to be a victim, but one of those,
reframe that. Yes.
one of those guys who tries to organize and manage sustainability/ESG within the corporation. And the standards and frameworks that exist today or are at the horizon honestly keep us quite busy. Not only me, but also hundreds of experts and colleagues within our corporation. So to be very clear, we think that standards are really necessary or inevitable to have a smooth and common understanding what has to be done, how things have to be measured and managed. And so this is our general understanding. And I can share also one perspective. As all of you know, our company had a significant incident in the past years that we call diesel crisis. And this was for us a kind of carte blanche situation where things had been questioned, the product portfolio, the strategic direction. And at that time, our decarbonization program, as we have it today, was set up. And the TCFD requirements and framework helped us a lot in shaping it because it was easy to understand. Everybody could immediately figure out what has to be done. And this is my message because I feel that today we have so many standards and frameworks around causing kind of Babylonian language confusion because all these requirements that exist beyond the mandatory reporting on top, the capital market requirements, we have ratings, we have prior ratings, non-prioritized ratings. We have opened up at least 10 communication reporting channels in order to satisfy our stakeholders. And that's simply too much because this causes a lot of stress and also frustration within the organization. And we try to streamline this internally to make it manageable. And this is my general statement to keep it as manageable and compact as possible. And I think the standards that have been mentioned by Lee go in a very good direction in that.
Fascinating. So this is the practical challenges of actually trying to think about what these mean for you on a business level.
Right.
And it's interesting because we've talked about the different stakeholders that are making these requests for disclosure. So whether it is, I think you said Joan and Jill or Jack and Jill on the street wanting to understand and compare in a standardized fashion what the impact of their investments might be and the impact of climate change on their investments. But Elena, I wonder if you could come in on this point as well and really just shed a light on what you feel as though the role for financial institutions are in this arena. And I know that you've got some fairly strong opinions in terms of to what extent should these requirements be voluntary, and we've already talked about deadlines. What level of ambition should we be requiring from companies?
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Let me start by highlighting that reporting is really important, obviously, and consistency in reporting even more. But reporting is just the means towards an end, and we need not to lose sight of what we are trying to achieve. And what we're trying to achieve is to put an end to climate change and to the ecological crisis. So what we're trying to achieve is that in less than 7 years, we have half emissions, global emissions, and then in 27, we have reached net zero. So unfortunately, we don't have the luxury to have that time to go through a logical process of voluntary, comply or explain, and so forth. Because let me tell you something, transformational change is tough, and it means, what it says, transformational change. With that, having said that, in terms of the financial institutions, we live in a capitalist economy, right? So financial institutions are the very core. And the role of financial institutions is precisely and very much goes into what and how they invest and what and how they finance. What we are interested about financial institutions is the finance emissions. Yes, it's very nice to have the Scope 1 and Scope 2 and the Scope 3 operational ones, but that's tell us only a tiny bit. In fact, some studies, and I think CDP has made a study that tells you that asset managers, for example, finance emissions is 400 times higher than the other three together combined. So what we need from financial institutions is that A, they decarbonize the portfolio, credit and investment portfolios, in line with 1.5 trajectory, with no or little overshoot, in line with the IPCC's recommendation. Number two, what we need is that they invest in those technologies, products and services that would allow the rest of the economy and sectors to do the transition, and very much for that we have tools like the taxonomy that help on both the decarbonization and identifying the right activities and technologies. And thirdly, that they accompany companies, that they work with companies, in order to help them to do that transition. For that, what it is key for me are two things. One, transition plans, really complete, detailed, strong transition plans, that they meet the criteria. And may I point out to the 9 recommendations that the UN highly level expert group that I was part, recommended. And on the other hand, the taxonomy, because transition plans operate at entity level, right? They set the direction of travel. The taxonomy is the detail. The taxonomy is bottom-up. It's at asset and activity level, in a way, particularly through CapEx and CapEx plan, in a way that sum up of CapEx plans that the company develops form that overall transition plan. And I'm happy to extend it. But, bottom line is, I'm afraid to say that there's more to come, and we need to move from reporting regulation to behavioral regulation.
That's a great point. And actually, Taylor, I'd love you to come in on this point as well, in terms of supporting businesses to think through understanding the baseline of activity today, but then also what they can actually do about it to activate that change.
Well, I'm super excited to be here. I'm a co-founder of Watershed, and we build software to help companies manage all of this, to help companies measure and reduce and report their emissions. And to Lena's point, we're not in this to report pretty graphs. We're in this to try to solve the climate crisis. And just to connect a few threads here, I think we're at a pretty exciting time where for the last couple of years, you come to conversations like this, and the thing that's on all of our minds is the kind of inconsistent alphabet soup of regulations and standards that don't really talk to each other. And we're not fully out of the woods on that, but I think we're at a pretty exciting moment where around the world, there is a common core of global climate disclosure. It was set up by TCFD. ISSB has done an awesome job of kind of enshrining it as a global standard. Every jurisdiction is doing a slight variation, but that core is there. Some exciting news today, the traditional straggler has been the US. And just yesterday, actually, California passed through the legislature a bill, SB 253, that is kind of very simple climate disclosure mandates for all US companies with over $1 billion in revenue. It still has to be signed by the governor, but you can kind of imagine a world where there is a standard baseline of global climate disclosure regulations, and that's really exciting. And I think 2 years ago we didn't have that. The fact that we almost have that in 2023 is a big moment. I think that now means it's kind of go time, and it's action time. And it's action time in two dimensions. One, to Daniel's point, operationalizing those standards within companies is really hard. And it is only going to get harder. I think the next 18 months are a really challenging time within companies, especially as folks wrap their heads around the CSRD, as folks kind of upgrade this data from CSR report to what does it mean to really be financial grade. And so there's a ton of work on actually operationalizing these new standards. And then to Elena's point, it's all about how does that turn into action. I think that's probably the zone where there is space for more standardization. There's been so much good discussion today about transition planning. I do think that is the focal point. And the thing that we see with companies is, it is really possible, if you measure in the right way, it is really possible to get to that vision of how different teams can actually operationalize net zero. And I think if we can spend more of our mental energy on that, that's going to be a good thing.
Really fascinating. So one of the sort of most salient points that I'm picking up from all of this is the need to have as much harmonization and standardization as possible, but that's not always an easy thing to achieve. So I'd love to come back to you, Lee, actually, on the next question, which is, how can the ISSB work towards creating a common baseline for disclosure standards that's applicable across different jurisdictions and industries? We know that that's something which is a challenging and deeply complex space, but I'd love for you to shine a light on that for us.
Thank you very much, and this really is exactly where we are today and looking ahead. It builds on the momentum that in those earlier comments I suggested, but just to give a little bit of clarity, not only did I make reference to the Financial Stability Board and the culmination of the work and the TCFD being passed through to the ISSB, but they did that because the architecture of S1 and S2 is based on TCFD. And so if we hear already from the remarks Taylor made and others made about the momentum that's already developed from there, our architecture means, and I won't use the word seamless, that would be overplaying it, but there is certainly a pathway that if people have already been using TCFD, then they can move across to using S1 and S2. Now, we also heard some remarks from the panellists about, local jurisdictions wanting to do what they need to do, and we respect that and understand that's part of what they need to put in place for their own reporting needs. But our reach, our encouragement, our plea in some ways to those jurisdictions is to build upon S1 and S2 as the baseline. If we can deliver the baseline, I'll come back why that's so important, it means that jurisdictions can build their own policy reasons, their own needs on top of the global baseline. Now, why that baseline is so important, it starts out, the journey to create the ISSB was not a whim in any sense of the foundation, or the trustees or anyone else. It was literally a response, formally a response from the global investor community and other key organisations to create the ISSB. And so we were there to serve, we were there to respond to those needs, and the needs from the global investor community and others was we need a global baseline. And just to add to that, because we did hear a little bit around there's still some confusion, different levels of requirements. During the course of 22 and into 23, we have undertaken significant levels of consolidation in order to bring clarity to the requirements going forward. That included CDSB, it included the former SASB, the IIRC, engagement with the World Economic Forum, and as I mentioned earlier, with the TCFD. So we feel there's a good process now. We've got standards that have gone through very rigorous due process. Obviously, as I made reference earlier, IOSCO has examined very closely for their purposes of endorsement. And so the product is fit for purpose now. It's up to us to now engage jurisdictions and the preparer community in order to start their adoption. Doesn't mean you have to do everything on day one, but we need to start to move it along.
That's really interesting. And perhaps we could turn to you now, Daniel, on this question of the need for standardization and the challenges that exist at present around interoperability and the reporting burden. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, maybe I can share some current status from the so-called machine room in our company when trying to digest all the frameworks and standards, and coming also to your point, which I really liked, is that our actual purpose is to manage the issue and not only to invest time in reporting. For us, reporting is the result of the activities. And I talked about the crisis, and one of our major decisions was to put sustainability/ESG at the center of the corporate strategy. This is what you often hear, but we had some internal decisions being made, so the restructuring of the sustainability department, the headcount rise, etc. So then we implemented ESG in the corporate strategy, which we call New Auto, and we then rethought our materiality exercise. What are the real levers in the capital market, especially in order to manage ESG? And then we came out with 6 focus issues, just 6, and maybe 2 handful of KPIs, which are the basis for managing ESG. Because we thought, or we analyzed, that these KPIs represent roughly 2/3 of the overall score potential, be it ratings or other stakeholder requests. And we thought that this is really a way managing the complexity of the issue. Today, we have the situation that if you just take, for example, the CSRD, without bashing anyone, we just calculated 2 weeks ago the number of data points we will have to report on the SRS standards. And guess the number. You don't have to guess, I will tell you.
Yeah, you told me before.
It's 1,341 data points.
Okay.
So this is the mandatory reporting covering the double materiality, which is the result of the analysis. Of course, you can configure this a little bit and maybe drill down the number, but there is a sheer number of reporting data points, qualitative and quantitative. On top of that, you have to see that there are further stakeholder demands. So we have prioritized ESG ratings that do not map perfectly with these standards. We have other requests like EcoVadis. We will have the UN Global Compact communication and progress in front of us. And you just add all these requirements, then you just reach an unmanageable amount of KPIs. And you always have to question yourself, what are the true levers in order to manage the issue? And this is, of course, just a part of those data points we will have to report on. So the discrepancy between what has to be really managed with focus and what has also to be reported because it's considered to be material, this discrepancy rises dramatically. And this is something that really keeps us quite busy. And I think it's a little bit counterintuitive for managing the issue itself. That is why my final statement would be that we really appreciate all the developments, be it the IFRS or also the taxonomy, to have really a compact set of KPIs with which you can translate it into the company and also keep the experts motivated who have to manage the issues.
Yeah, so it's a really important point, and I think I read something earlier that you've said, Taylor, in the past around it being so critical that sustainability departments are released back to do the good work of actually, as much as possible, to actually run the operation and make sure that they're embedding those things. So having this concentrated, standardized approach is going to be a really critical lever in enabling sustainability departments to focus on those things and then to actually do the work as well.
Yep. And I shared this kind of optimism about where we are on disclosure standards. I think the other interesting frontier is, we've now figured out, and maybe the CSRD has a particularly expansive view of that, but we know what to report. And so we're kind of getting to a point of standardization of what are companies going to tell the world. And everyone talks about this aspiration of having sustainability data be similar to financial data. So with financial data, 2 things are true. You know that if you take a certain set of actions, if you open a new market or customers love your product, you're going to see a certain result. And then investors know how to make sense of that. You report at the end of the quarter, the numbers are up, investors are happy. I think the other challenge on sustainability data and climate data in particular is how do we make sure that companies measure in a way that enables and rewards the right action? And it's more complicated to measure climate than it is to measure dollars because you have to do all these transformations to go from business activity to carbon. Everyone here knows about that. I think now is this really critical time for companies, and I think there's a role for regulators to make sure we're encouraging companies to kind of measure with the granularity and supplier specificity that basically says, if we take an action, it's going to show up in our carbon numbers. And when we report on that to investors, they're going to know the number went down because we bought clean power, we changed suppliers, or we deployed low carbon aluminum. And that's not a sure thing, right? You can use industry averages in a way across Scope 3 that actually disconnects, the reality of the action you're taking. The good news is it's possible. And so I think that's kind of the next frontier, is how do we make sure that this whole framework of what we report, where we've gotten to the standards, is complemented by the right approach to how we calculate it so that it motivates, rewards the right action in the world that lets, and it means there's less carbon in the atmosphere.
And that's a really interesting point to pick up on, actually. And I think maybe some people in the room might have come across CDP before in the work that we do, but we're the largest global nonprofit that fuels the environmental disclosure work of this year, over 20,000 corporates around the world. And we do that, we only have the ability to do that because we are given our license to operate by over 750 financial institutions that give us, that support us in doing that work and make that request through us. And exactly to your point, the value of reporting is then that these financial institutions could be institutional investors, could be banks, could be insurers, credit ratings agencies, are able to take that data, understand the baseline of their own portfolio, to your point earlier about financed emissions, and then actually engage with those companies and ideally also provide incentives. And we're starting to see that coming through in different ways with sustainability-linked lending relating to not just carbon, but also deforestation risk and water security. And that's really exciting to see. But certainly in the conversations that I'm having with financial institutions, there are still some major challenges ahead in terms of mainstreaming this activity. My dream at night is to see a world in which but it genuinely is, where every single piece of financing has sustainability as a key element to it. It's not just something that sits on the side under a special department, it's mainstreamed. But there are challenges ahead. So maybe I think, Eleanor, would you like to come in on this in terms of where, and I know certainly you as well, Jean-Paul, it would be great to have some comments.
I think that the best way to give an answer to your wise comment and the comment made by this gentleman is to implement what we are doing. Okay? So it means, first of all, to start at the international level. Okay? And that's what we did. Let us be clear, the history is not an old history. Day one is in fact less than 2 years ago, not far from me in Glasgow. It was the COP26. For me, the most important aspect of finance, it was of course defense, because I know there was some speaker before us, but also the announcement made by the Everest Foundation to launch the ISSB. And I think that I may say, it's quite difficult to say that publicly because I'm rather not objective and rather subjective, that the game changer in the study was the pressure that we put on the IFRS Foundation to convince them to be the leader for developing standards at international. Not easy for them, because it means know-how, human resource. But I belong to the group of supervisors who thought that was the right address, not far from me, in fact in London, the ISSB. And the advantage we have, it's a fantastic one, because we start most of the time from scratch. For the time being, there are already some framework, for instance, CSRD in the EU, excellent, I would say, but nothing is enforceable. Something amazing what I'm telling you, but I can tell you there is a huge difference with something that Daniel knows very well. When we had to endorse, when we decided to endorse the ISSB standard, accounting standard, also promoted by the IFRS Foundation 20 years ago, it was much more difficult. One example, how do you account for goodwill? When you have accounting standard already used in Germany, in Japan, in the US, it's not the same reality to think about how to translate in your account organic growth, aggressive takeover bids. So it was a really challenge. Of course, there are many challenges about scope, but we start from scratch. And that's the reason I think, that was my personal view, we need to convince Erkki Liikanen, Lee, Emmanuel Faber to do that. So it means less than 2 years ago. Second element, which is instrumental in order to have common language and then to give work to people like you to extract data, CDP, okay? So it's to have the capacity to be on time. On time, Finance Day, Glasgow. On time, launch of a new board with excellent people. On time, a Belgium compromise. Yes, there are also good Belgium compromise. I'm not objective about multiplication. On time, about prototype and draft. And then the pressure is on me, as chair of IOSCO, to endorse that. Not to give a stem, I can tell you he's still alive and kicking, but we challenge a lot. And let us be clear, I would like to say something to the gentleman. The first word I learned when I had the pleasure to be engaged by a supervisor 30 years ago was about proportionality, accountability, justification. We are not working on very tall. And that's what we're doing with SM1, and we discuss a lot. Scope of SME. Scope 3, we need to have ambition, but for this we need data. And we all know that it's not the case. Safe harbor for this. So it means step-by-step basis. Without that, I'm used to saying, for me, the most important is that the train start on time. That's the case. Endorsement, no, in July. What expected? Nobody. That's the reason why there was such a press coverage for a press conference. I can tell you, 40 journalists from around the world. It doesn't happen frequently in the Committee of Supervisors. Even for the FSB of the G20, it's a lot of people. I think it's maybe also because people were surprised that we're able to say, okay, we are fine. There is an adoption guidance also providing, let us start. But I'm the first one to say, the train start on time. Everybody will be there, everything will be there, sorry, for the filing of 24. Also Asian standards, audit standards, ethical standards. But it means, for me, the train will start on time, but the speed and the size of the train won't be the same in all jurisdictions, because we know that there are different aspects which are not aligned, but the most important is to start on time, and that's what we are doing.
And this is such a critical point, and forgive me, speaking of on time, we have a couple of questions that have come in, so we need to be mindful of that, but maybe, Elena, apologies, 1 minute on this question of what is missing. So we hear about this critical data that's going to be coming through these disclosures, we know this matters, but then it will fall into the hands of practitioners and financiers. Is the industry ready to absorb this data? What are the gaps, do you feel? What are the missing parts in order to see my dream come alive of every banker knowing how to use this information, or investors?
Data.
Yeah. Well, if I may say, I was talking before about the importance on one hand on transition plans, on the other hand on taxonomy, yeah? And I think that missing piece is actually the taxonomy. Let me explain very briefly. The European taxonomy on sustainable activities basically is a classification that tells you which economic activities can be considered sustainable under which circumstances. But it's much more than that. You were talking about these two worlds of the financial world on one hand and the environmental world on the other. That's exactly what the taxonomy is. It's the first time that it's an instrument to capture environmental performance through financial metrics. Daniel was talking about, let's simplify it, we need just a few KPIs. Well, there you go. You have revenues alignment, you have CapEx alignment, and OpEx alignment. And the interesting thing about the taxonomy is not only it tells you where a company is, the activities of a company are today, that is the picture, right? How aligned they are, but actually that all the investments they make to become sustainable, to align with the taxonomy, are considered green. All of them will have that label. And why that is very important? Because the entire sustainability finance package of the European Union has been made in order that all the different pieces are designed to incentivize taxonomy-aligned investments. We can already see in the market, how investors are asking for, the greatest taxonomy alignment, both in revenues and in CapEx. It's the very first time that we see in the market portfolios that they are driven not by revenues, aligned to activities that are sustainable, but actually that CapEx. So this is, how it is, mobilizing capital towards sustainable activities. And I will end by saying that the first reporting, this is the first year that we're having the first reporting from corporates, the largest companies. And all the data that's coming out is that the CapEx alignment figures are much higher than the revenues alignment, and that's particularly true on the high impact sectors, that is utilities, energy, real estate. So basically we're starting to see in the ground how companies are investing to become aligned with the taxonomy, which means to really, become low carbon.
Fascinating, thank you. We've got just under 10 minutes left, so I'd really like to skip to some of these questions. And I think this is really at the heart, again, of what you were both saying earlier. So I'd like to take the third one here. How do we ensure that the large reporting requirements under the CSRD actually are used strategically and can contribute to sustainability action? So maybe Taylor, we'll start with you, and then Daniel, we'll come to you on this one.
I think that the key is to use this kind of measurement reporting moment as two things. One is a kind of internal mobilization around getting the right people around the organization clued into where their impact's coming from, where their impact can be. And I think the other piece is to make sure that we measure in a way that motivates action. And there are two ways, at least in the kind of carbon and climate space in particular, it's true in other sustainability categories as well. There is a fork in the road on how are you going to measure scope 3, how are you going to approach your suppliers. And I think at the beginning, when you're setting the baseline, is the critical moment on making sure that you measure in a way that if you take the right set of action, it shows up on the report card at the end of the year.
Brilliant, thank you. And Daniel?
Yeah, so to the question, when I talked about the sheer number of data points, I would also like to stress that taking the SRES standards or the CSRD, we think that they map quite well with our strategic focus issues. So we have 6 of them. One of those is, without any doubt, decarbonization. I would also say this is maybe the most material issue we have in our company. And of course, this is part of the SRES standards. It's the E1 of the E standards. And this topic or the standard maps quite well with what we're doing. So there's no complete contradiction. It's just the sheer number of unfolding data points that is connected to that, and only a selection of those are KPIs that we consider as really material and having the statement. And this is so not a dramatical mismatch, but we think that the way what you do out of it and how to translate it into action, objectives and key results, this is what we are doing, and this is our strategic roadmap. And then also ensure that we are, on the reporting side, compliant.
Fantastic. We've had a question come in with someone who's been brave enough to put their name against it, which I like. So I'm going to go to that one. It's from Amanda Carpenter. What role do the panel feel there is for leadership in creating the culture within all firms to ensure reporting is seen as a strategic priority? Which I think is a really interesting question, because we do hear occasionally, dare we say it, I'm not looking for any reason at all there, of some companies viewing reporting as a burden, as a bureaucratic exercise, and that's entirely the wrong way of viewing this, obviously, and I'm not just saying this as somebody who leads the capital market side at CDP. The whole point of reporting is to really deeply engage with the activity of taking stock of, firstly, where are we at? What is our baseline? What is our risk and opportunity for our businesses? Do we have the right level of accountability, of consideration around these risks, of these dependencies on climate change and indeed impacts? But also, how can we make sure that we future-proof our business and the communities around us and the resources around us to make sure that we actually have a license to operate and an opportunity to flourish in future? So it's the furthest thing from a boring tick box exercise that you can actually get to if it's really engaged with in the right spirit. But perhaps we can come to you, Ian, on this, actually.
Yeah.
What role do you feel there?
Frankly speaking, I don't think that there is a problem about leadership. We released the endorsement of ISSB standard on the 25th of July. Less than 1 week after that, the same day, the European Commission, EFRAC, and the IFRS Foundation published reports saying interoperability is a fact. So it means with the endorsement of ISSB standards that we think that 130,000 listed companies will apply in different stages a common language. And it will be a virtuous circle in order to ensure the capacity to extract data. Okay? In Europe, the scope of CSRD is very large, 50,000 companies, right? It means in some countries, like in Belgium, multiplied by 10. For this, I think that we have to say we appreciate the effort made by the EFRAC. Let us be clear. They reduce the number of disclosure. It's also the case for, it's a step-by-step approach. And then when you think about leadership, just after the endorsement ISSB, you have the letter sent by one of my neighbors in the Netherlands, Knaas Knot, the chair of the FSB, sending a letter to the G20, the meeting of the leaders last week, saying one game changer about climate, that was the endorsement by ISSB. So I'm not sure that there is other possibility to create leadership maybe on another planet, but everybody agrees. We are going the same direction. Does it mean that we are on the same line about everything? No, it wouldn't be true. And that's the legitimacy of the EU to say, we think that we have, I would say, faster priorities on some aspect. That's normal, but there is a global framework, and it starts on time, it's decided on time, and then it will be, I would say, no, the job for the implementation with a lot of Q&A. And for this, IFRS Foundation was able to provide an adoption guidance at jurisdiction level. So let us start. It won't be easy, and I think, if I may, because I was in the train from Brussels, what we have to avoid is this. You know this kind of magazine, Paris Match, the same in London, so for, I would say, VIP. And one of the favorite slogans of Paris Match is to say the weight of the words, the shock of the picture. And that's our common job. It's about education. There are many education, but it's about disclosure. It's about peer review. It's about comparability. It doesn't mean that all the financial statement will become green. It will be a rather technical aspect. Some of the readers of your report will be disappointed because it's not about picture, it's not about some slogan, everything is green. It's how to explain that you are able to reach your objective and how to compare the quality of the implementation of your standards with peers. I'm not sure that everybody is ready to do that, and it's also about the capital. If it's not the case, it will, I would say, be a fantastic incentive negative for greenwashing. That's the reason why we need a global common language.
Fantastic. We have just over 2.5 minutes left, which is not long, and I don't want to keep you all from lunch. So, Elena, Ian, do you want to come in on this point as well, very briefly?
Very briefly, I think it's very important for companies that seek capital in Europe to understand one thing, that the 55% of all the assets under management in Europe are market as ESG or green. That means that for that 55%, the 40+ indicators that call the principal adverse impacts and the taxonomy are the two key drivers for the creation of those portfolios, that asset managers are asked to set tolerance levels on that and to set, targets on taxonomy. So therefore, companies that actually want to be part of those portfolios, they better get their act together on the 14+ indicators on the taxonomy.
Fantastic, thank you. And Ian?
Very quickly, just to explain that the creation of S1 and S2 really does put a very different perspective, a very different focus, and importantly around the business model and looking ahead to the shaping of the enterprise value of that business model. So let me just reiterate, not a compliance exercise, not about just filling out the forms, but in reality disclosing the narrative, disclosing the real benefits, but the risks associated with that business model in a very different perspective. And for me, I sense that's real gold to good organisations that really want to shape their credentials and explain their story. Absolutely.
I think that's a really important message to land on for the last minute of this panel. So I think we've heard some really interesting perspectives today, and I've got a minute countdown flashing up at me. But I think we can all agree, I think that the work of the ISSB and the work towards a standardised, harmonised future is an incredibly important one to focus minds on the most material points for disclosure, but also for consideration and decision readiness and investment. So lots of positive reasons why this is going to actually spell a really positive burst into this next leg of progress. But equally, really important to see that we move beyond a perception of thinking that reporting in of itself as an activity is sufficient. It's a critical building block, but we also need to see that as a stepping stone towards greater ambition, action, and integration in terms of thinking about what this means for businesses in the real world. So thank you, everybody on the panel, for supporting this today and for your insights. I really appreciate it. Everyone, please enjoy your lunch. We'll be back at 2:30.